My name is Father Anthony Suhu. I'm a Jesuit who teaches at the Faculty of Oriental Studies and Ancient Near Eastern Studies at the Pontifical Biblical Institute. I just have a few organizational notes before we begin. If you would like access to the Wi-Fi, there is a, if you check your connections, the Open PUG, P-U-G, website or the network is the one that you can use, and there is no need for a password. Okay? All right. Today it is my great pleasure to introduce Roberto Nicolai from La Sapienza University in Rome. Roberto is the author of more than 200 contributions, mainly on Greek historical and geographical literature and on Attic tragedy. Among his publications are La Storiografia nell'Educazione Antica and Studi su Socrate. In 1998, he edited an Italian translation of Polybius. In 2000, with Giusto Traiana, he translated Strabo 11 and 12. He has also contributed to the Handbook on Greek Literature by Rossi and has been a member of the editorial board of the Encyclopedia Oratiana. He's the director of the Seminari Romani di Cultura Greca and is a member of numerous scientific committees and on several journals and series. And today's lecture by Roberto will be Eidolon before Idolatry, Notes on the History of the Word. So without further ado, Professor Nicolai.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation, and thank you to the organizer for the invitation. I'm glad to be here. In the Gospel of Matthew, the centurion addresses Jesus with a sentence that has in part entered the Catholic liturgy. Kyrie, uk eimi ikanos in amu upoten stegen eiseltes, alla monon eipe logo, kai atesetai opais mu. Domine non sum dignus in the Vulgate text. Words are foundational in religion as in human experience, and the analysis of their meanings and uses remains one of the most essential critical tools. It is therefore to the word that stands at the center of my inquiry that we must now turn, eidolon. A preliminary problem must be addressed. Is it legitimate to draw fine-grained semantic distinctions in order to align ancient terms with our own categories? In other words, did a Greek speaker perceive the differences that the little Scott Jones Greek-English dictionary sets out? So, perhaps with that. Okay. This is the item of the little Scott Jones, phantom, any absubstantial form, image reflected in a mirror or in water, and so on. Of the 8 meanings listed in Little Scott Jones, only number 4, image of a god, idol, is attested exclusively in the books of the Old and New Testament, and is subsequently taken up in Christian literature and in a limited number of inscriptions. Montanari, Dizionario Greco-Italiano, distributes the semantic range in a comparable way and adds the case of Helen of Troy. None of the dictionaries I have consulted, however, makes any reference to Stesichorus Palynod, the text that first introduces the eidolon, the image of Helen. Chantraine, Dictionnaire étymologique de la langue grecque, propose the meaning image avec la nuance d'être irréel, reflet, lié à pseudos, falsehood. My preference is for Chantrin's interpretation, since it avoids an excessive multiplication of distinct senses. This point, however, still calls for further consideration. It is worth noting that the meaning image in reference to a statue, or more generally to a work of art, is not attested. One may compare Herodotus, Book 1, 51, Eidolon Chrysion, and then the next one, Herodotus, Book 6. It is not easy. So, Book 6, 58. I here begin with the case of Helen, which is perhaps one of the most revealing. In Stesichorus' Palynod, Helen reaches Troy in the form of an eidolon. The term itself does not occur in the passage of Plato's Phaedrus, where 3 verses of the Palynod are quoted. This text, Socrates is referring to the need for a purification, katarmos, a procedure unfamiliar to Homer, but known to Stesichorus, by means of which the poet was said to have recovered his sight. The known eidolon is attested in the anonymous commentator who, on the authority of Chameleon, speaks of 2 Palynods by Stesichorus, one directed against Homer and the other against Hesiod. This is the text. According to this testimony, it was Helen's eidolon that went to Troy, while the real Helen remained in Egypt at the court of Proteus. In what we might describe as an attempt to eliminate implausible and fantastic elements from the traditional narrative, Herodotus attributes to the Egyptian priest a version in which Helen stayed with Proteus and never reached Troy at all. Her absence from Troy, moreover, did not prevent the destruction of the city. Herodotus does not mention the eidolon, which reappears by contrast in Euripides' Helen. I quote some 10 lines from the prologue, spoken by Helen herself, in which she recounts the antecedents of the drama. Helen's eidolon is described as empnun. It is further specified that it is composed of ether, uranou xunteis apo, and that what is given to Paris is not the real Helen, but a mere empty semblance, kenen dokesin. The eidolon is fashioned by Hera in her anger at being defeated by Aphrodite. This detail deserves to be emphasized, since in other instances too, it is the gods who produce an eidolon. A comparable, though more concise version is found at Euripides' Electra. Where it is Zeus who sends Helen's eidolon to Ilion. The question arises whether, and indeed on what grounds, the case of Helen's eidolon should be distinguished from that of the eidolon of Aeneas created by Apollo, around which Trojans and Achaeans engage in fierce combat. Book 5 of Iliad. At Odyssey, Book 4, next one, Athena produces the eidolon of a woman, Iphthime. A little further, the eidolon fashioned by Athena reaches Penelope. Of particular interest here is the adjective amauros, dim, indistinct, barely perceptible, which is characteristically applied to the shades of the deed. The shades of the deed are referred to at Odyssey Book 11, a line in 476, a line in connection with which one might ask whether the distinction between phantom and ghost drawn by Little Scott John is in fact justified. The verse occurs in the speech addressed by the soul of Ajax to Odysseus. Whether we are dealing with an eidolon produced by a god or with the shades of the deed, we are in both cases confronted with figures lacking real substance, characterized by their complete likeness to the persons they represent and by their capacity to deceive the beholder. To the same context belongs 1183. Still in the Nequia, Odysseus vainly attempts to embrace his mother. Odysseus' mother is said to be like a shadow or a dream, similes that attempt to bring within the range of human understanding something that lies beyond it. One may also compare 11,213, where the reference to the shade of the dead mother merges with an image produced by divinity, in this case Persephone. The passage shows with clarity that certain modern distinctions are not only inapplicable, but potentially misleading. Other passages I could speak about, but there is no time. A passage in some respects more complex and elusive than those discussed so far is Aeschylus' Agamemnon. In the course of his long races, Agamemnon speaks of his companion in the Trojan War and declares that, with the exception of Odysseus, whose fate remains unknown to him, those who claimed to be most faithful to him are the image of a shadow, eidolon skias. The expression recalls in its form, though not in its substance, Pindar's famous formulation, and Sophocles, Kufen eidolos operzomen e Kufen skian. In both passages, the aim is to underscore a lack of real substance. In Pindar, that of human life. In Aeschylus, that of those who wish to appear most loyal to Agamemnon. A further development of the same idea is found in Sophocles. Where Oedipus perceives himself as eidolon without substance. This is the closing lines of the Races of Oedipus. And now, an apophthegm attributed to Solon and transmitted by Diogenes Laertius runs as follows. Elege de ton men logon eidolon einaiton ergon, basilea de ton iskyrotaton te dynamei. The usual translation are along the lines of speech is the mirror of action. and another that the strongest and most capable is king. Yet, separating the two clauses may not be the only possible interpretation. To state that the king is the strongest in power is, at the very least, a truism. If, however, the two clauses are taken together, the saying recalls the well-known formulation of Gorgias Helen, chapter 8, Logos is a powerful potentate, who with frailest, feeblest frames works wonders. The word lacks physical substance and yet produces effects. And Gorgias goes on in the sequel of the passage to describe the impact of poetry upon its hearers. Interpreted in this way, Solon's say could be translated. He said that Logos is an image of the action, but the most powerful king in terms of authority. In two fragments, the first from Philolaus, the second reporting the opinion of Democritus or Epicurus, followed by Empedocles, the term is used in an optical context. In the former, to describe the nature of the sun as a reflection in a mirror that transmits the light of the cosmic fire, in the latter within a theory of visual perception. Philolaus and Democritus, Epicurus, Empedocles. The term takes on a figurative meaning in Isocrates, Nicocles. Here, discourse endowed with specific ethical qualities is presented as the image of a good and trustworthy soul. Up to the Hellenistic period, Plato is the author in whose works the term eidolon occurs more frequently. Among the dialogues, the Republic has the highest number of attestations, with 18 occurrences. We may begin with Book 2. This is the first occurrence in the Republic. In Book 4, the term is used in reference with the justice, to the justice dikaiosune. Here, the correct performance of one own function appears as an eidolon of justice, that is, as its visible and practical manifestation on the level of social actions. Occurrences become markedly more frequent in Book 7. Within the first passage, within the allegory of the cave, Eidola occupy the intermediate stage between shadows and the things themselves. The next one, in reference to the future hearers, having seen the truth, they are required to return to the cave. Only in this way will they be able to recognize the Eidola for what they are and to determine of what they are images. And so on, still in reference to the allegory of the cave, the movement of liberation is described as a progressive reorientation from shadows to Eidola, and from these to the light and to the things themselves. The passage makes clear that the distinction between different levels of cognition correspond to a hierarchy of images and reality. And so, finally, in the context of the distinction of knowledge by means of doxa and episteme, the eidolon becomes the object grasped by opinion, rather than by knowledge, whoever is unable to define the good itself comes into contact not with being, but only with some eidolon, and therefore lives in a condition comparable to dreaming. We may now turn to Book 9 of Republic, of Plato's Republic. This one, and following passages of Plato's Republic. Here, the tyrant is said to live at a threefold remove from truth and from true pressure. The eidolon here marks a precise degree of ontological and epistemic distance. Book 10 is decisive for the Platonic conception of poetry as an imitation removed by 3 degrees from the truth. You can see mimesis, the word mimesis, mimetike techne, the eidolon produced by a painter, and so on. In this discussion, Homer, the poet Homer, is directly addressed. This is the imitator, mimetes, is defined as an eidolou demiurgos, a producer of empty images. Socrates grants, for the sake of argument, that Homer may occupy not the third but the second position in relation to aletheia, the truth. And ask which cities he has in fact made better through his poetry. One may ask whether the images produced by the poet are not comparable to Helen's eidolon, that is, to a vacuous replica of reality. I cannot complete the analysis of the passages. I can only show some passages from Book 10, tus poieticus mimetas, eidolon aretes einai, o tu eidolu poietes, o mimetes, creation of eidola and mimesis, imitation. Eidola, eidolo poiunta, who creates eidola. I cannot analyze all the passages by Plato where eidolon appear. I can only say that in Plato, the term eidolon is applied to spheres that our classificatory habits tend to keep apart. The theory of knowledge and the study of perception, especially visual perception, epistemology, and the theory of poetry. Yet these distinctions are not only forced and in any case properly applicable only from Aristotle onwards. They also lead us away from the truth. Whatever translation one adopts, an eidolo is an image capable of standing at different degrees of remove from reality, up to the extreme of falsehood. An instructive parallel for some Platonic passages is provided by Alcidamas Perisophiston. Other Platonic passages, and then Perisophiston. Written discourses, Alcidamas argues, should not properly be called logoi at all, but are rather to be regarded as images, forms and limitations of logoi. They deserve the same consideration as bronze statues, stone figures, or painted representation of living beings. The point is reiterated in the second passage, where he speaks about eikoni logu, a mere resemblance of the living speech. Such a use opens the way to the sense of the image of a divinity, whose only consistency is that of the material of which it is made. Idolatry. An illuminating comparison for Alcidamas' passage is offered by archaic lyric. Pindar contrasts his song with bronze statues, which, by their very nature, remain immobile. The figurative arts are evoked at Xenophon's Symposium, this passage, where the word eidolon is present many ways, 4 ways. Some brief concluding remarks. The inquiry proposed here calls for a reconsideration of the very logic on which our dictionaries are constructed. The distinction of meanings corresponding to modern linguistic categories is in fact often illusory. One might even say that it itself is a false eidolon, since it does not reflect real semantic differences in the text. It may prove more fruitful to distinguish not so much between meanings as between terms and speaker and spheres of reference. In the present case, eidolon as applied to the shadowy life of the hereafter, to optics, to the process of knowledge, to artistic imitation, and so forth. If we turn to the reference of the term eidolon, 2 points become clear. First, we are always within the domain of vision. Secondly, the term may designate something immaterial, such as sunlight or the soul of Odysseus' mother, as well as something material, such as a statue or more generally a work of figurative art, which nonetheless remains distinct from the real object. In the field of epistemology and in the closely related domain of poetic theory, Plato uses the term to denote an image or imitation that do not coincide with reality, and these are indeed removed from it by several degrees. The Platonic association of eidolon with the noun pseudos, falsehood, and the adjective pseudes, false, may have paved the way for the later connection of the term with something false and deceptive, an idol precisely, which can become the object of worship and veneration without being what its devotees believe it to be. What ultimately emerges is that eidolon does not designate a class of object, but a relational mode of appearance. It marks a distance, visual, ontological, and cognitive, between what shows itself and what truly is. And for that very reason, it can become the visible focus of a belief whose object remains elsewhere. Thank you.
Our next speaker will be Noam Mizrahi, professor in the Department of Bible at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who specializes in the Dead Sea Scrolls, textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible, and the historical linguistics of Biblical Hebrew. His research also touches on the intersection of textual development, Second Temple literature, and ancient poetry. Due to unforeseen circumstances, Professor Mizrahi's presentation is recorded, but hopefully he will be able to join us by Zoom for questions and answers.
Greetings from Jerusalem.
Many texts in the Hebrew Bible discuss idolatry from a variety of vantage points, considering it as both a theological and intellectual challenge as well as a marker of social differentiation, often functioning as an anthropological mechanism of defining an in-group, such as the Israelites, versus various outgroups, such as the Canaanite peoples. By contrast, the topic plays a different and less salient role in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and more specifically in the sectarian works found among the Qumran manuscripts. The main reason is that the sectarian works direct their attention into the theological, political, legal, and social rifts that were tearing apart the Jewish society in the late Hellenistic and early Roman periods. Since sectarian groups relied heavily on scriptural literature, they often resorted to appropriate biblical themes, language, narratives, and concepts in the framework of their own contemporary discourse. For instance, as the late Aaron Shemesh has demonstrated, the internal sectarian rules regulating relations between community members and outsiders were closely modeled after the scriptural laws regarding interaction with Gentiles. Within this ideological matrix, a Jewish outsider was regarded as equal to Gentile, and this perception was not necessarily restricted to the formal realm of religious law, or halakha. By the same token, religious beliefs and practices deemed forbidden in sectarian thinking could, and indeed were, reframed as either equal or even identical to idolatry, as part of contemporaneous polemical discourse. This usage, however, does not reflect sustained thinking about idolatry as such. Rather, idolatry was repurposed for other inner Jewish needs, be they rhetorical or conceptual. Thus, reflections on idolatry per se are not as common in the Qumran sectarian literature as they are in the Hebrew Bible. Many of them, especially those included in legal works such as the Damascus document or Zedekite fragments, the Temple Scroll, and some precepts of the law, Miktzat Maaseh HaTorah, were surveyed by Larry Schiffman in several related studies. As he observed, virtually all these sources treat idolatry primarily as a social label, a characteristic of Gentile nations, and hence as something that needs to be regulated as part of interacting with outsiders. In this paper, I do not intend to review the evidence collected and analyzed by Schiffman, but rather draw attention to a source not included in his survey, which in my view is a bit more informative about the theoretical perception of idolatry in sectarian thinking than many of the legal sources that he dealt with. The omission of this source from previous discussion is actually surprising since it is part of Pesher Habakkuk, which was one of the first 7 scrolls to become known to the scholarly world. My own thinking about it naturally developed some ideas whose seeds can be found in my commentary on this work, which I hope will soon be available not only in Hebrew but also in English. Yet the invitation to speak in this conference motivated me to rethink some points, expand the whole matter, and nuance my thoughts considerably, for which I am truly grateful for the organizers. As I write this paper under less than favorable conditions, I can only express my sincere apology and regret for not being able to be with you physically and learn from your interaction as much as I would have wished to do. I add 3 more preliminary comments before turning to reading the primary source itself. First, when one deals with a notion as philosophically complex and theologically charged as idolatry, one must consider at the very outset which of its many aspects is most relevant for the case under consideration. In order to allow an unique insight into the conceptual world of the primary sources, without imposing an ethic theoretical framework on them, I have deliberately chosen to take as a starting point a very literal reading of the Greek term Idolatria, namely idol worshipping. Obviously, this sense too is not devoid of certain assumptions. For the time being, however, I refrain from discussion of representational doctrines encapsulated in the notion of eidolon, or of the potential cultic and social practices hinted by the term latreia. What I would like to do in the time allotted to me is to consider in some detail two key texts and try to trace their notion of idolatry. Second, I must introduce very briefly Pesher Habakkuk for those of you who may not be well versed in the world of Qumran scholarship, which some consider to be as sectarian as the ancient literature itself. Pesher Habakkuk is an exegetical work, presenting itself as a running commentary on the prophecies of Habakkuk, excluding the psalm included in chapter 3. Thus, it systematically interprets each and every passage of the text included in our first two chapters of the canonical book. The quotations of the prophetic lemata are sometimes modified in accordance with the commentator's interests, suggesting a mutual diffusion of language and ideas between the interpreting text and the text being interpreted. The commentary follows a very specific hermeneutical method which decodes the prophetic text as relating to the author's recent history, contemporary events, and predictable future. This method is called pesher, a term borrowed via Aramaic from the technical vocabulary of Mesopotamian omina, in which it denotes prognostic interpretation. Although the precise channel of its transmission from Akkadian scientific literature to Second Temple Hebrew scribal culture remains unknown to us, it is clear that it was adapted, along with the hermeneutical theory and specific interpretive techniques, to scriptural interpretation in the Hellenistic Roman period. Third and finally, because this study deals with an exegetical work, I need to explain also very briefly the scriptural context of the text subject to interpretation. Habakkuk's prophecies conclude with a series of 5 dirges in Habakkuk 2, 5 to 20. The first 4 dirges follow a more or less consistent pattern and are couched in irony. Instead of expressing the pitiable plight of their subject, they describe the greedy destruction he has wrought. The 5th dirge, in verses 19 to 20, however, diverges thematically, structurally, and rhetorically from the preceding ones. Moreover, the 5th dirge is separated from the previous 4 by a self-standing admonition in verse 18 that is alien to the rest of this part of the prophetic book. It stands to reason, therefore, that from a compositional point of view, both the admonition and what is now the 5th dirge represent independent units that were appended to an originally shorter and more unified series of dirges. Importantly for our concern, these two segments deal explicitly with the notion of idolatry in the strict sense of the term, which explains why they are also treated differently by the sectarian commentator compared to the previous text. While the first 4 dirges are interpreted as dealing with specific individuals, namely the community's arch-enemies, the wicked priest and the preacher of lie, the admonition and the 5th dirge are taken to refer to the nations more generally. Two compositional segments are explicated respectively in 2 consecutive and complementary pesher units that conclude the whole work, to which I now turn. The admonition in verse 18 is phrased as a rhetorical question, but the wording is slightly different between the Masoretic text and the Pesher lemma. מה הועיל פסל כי פסלו יוצרו, מסכה ומורה שקר, כי בטח יוצר יצרו עליו, לעשות אלילים אילמים. What use is an idol once its maker has shaped it, a cast image, a teacher of lies? For its maker trusts in what has been made. producing mute idols, or deaf idols, according to the Greek and Syriac versions. The prophet highlights the idol's material properties as a man-made and hence lifeless object. The human agent is portrayed as the maker of the idol, who nonetheless puts his trust on the powerless object that he himself had produced. The prophetic admonition, therefore, mocks idolatry as an expression of the universal human gift for self-deception. A completely different portrayal of idolatry, however, is presented by the Pesher interpretation. פשר הדבר על כל פסלי הגויים, אשר יצרום לעובדם ולהשתחוות להמה, והמה לא יצילום ביום המשפט. The interpretation of the matter concerns all the idols of the nations, which they created in order to worship and prostrate to them, but they will not save them on the day of judgment. Here, the material properties of the idols are played down, whereas their powerless nature is demonstrated not by their dumbness, but rather by their inability to deliver their worshippers from the pending apocalypse. The human agents are still the makers of the idols, but they are characterized primarily by their behavioral patterns, namely the cultic practices that they direct toward the idols, which are not explicitly mentioned in the scriptural text. Noteworthy is also the difference in the time frame of the idol's expected impact. The prophetic admonition underscores that the idols are speechless, ilmim, hinting that their makers resort to false interpretation of ominous signs, moreh sheker. It seems, therefore, that the human audience expects the idols to react or respond in the present to their immediate needs. In the Pesherist interpretation, however, the emphasis shifts to the future day of judgment, and the use that one expects of one's idol is deliverance from an imminent death sentence. The Pesherist treatment of idolatry, therefore, is couched in apocalyptic mindset, contrary to the practical wisdom that seems to inform the prophetic admonition. But perhaps the most salient element of the Pesherist recasting of the prophetic content is the change of the ideological perspective from the universalistic outlook of the prophetic admonition to the ethnocentric viewpoint of the Pesher interpretation. The idols typify the nations, pislei hagoyim. It is the Gentiles, not the Jews, who produce them, worship them, and therefore subject to future annihilation, since they do not enjoy the protection of the only one real God, whom they do not acknowledge. Thus, the anthropological argument of the scriptural passage is translated into an assertion of ethnic distinction. Furthermore, the idols are perceived not in ontological terms, that is, as material objects, but rather in epistemological ones, as objects of human veneration and cultic worship. In other words, they are interpreted first and foremost as markers of social identities, ignoring the intellectual pondering on the nature of the divine and the definitional meaning of human practices that takes the center stage in the scriptural lemma. This peculiar reading is inextricably tied to a telling textual variant embedded in the scriptural lemma. While the prophetic admonition referred to incapacitated idols, elilim ilmim, the scribe responsible for our only extant copy of Pesher Habakkuk originally transcribed idols for nations, elilim leumim. This reading was later corrected by omitting the first lamed and adding another one on top of the vav. Crucially for our concern, the Pesherist interpretation makes no mention of the idol's muteness, whereas their function as a cultic marker labeling the nations is highlighted. It is difficult to discern, however, the chicken from the egg. Is the Pesher interpretation dependent on a variant vorlage that was faithfully reproduced in the lemma, according to the Prima Manu, or was the lemma adapted to the tendentious reading of the interpretation? Be that as it may, in its given form, both the prophetic admonition and its Pesher interpretation introduce a specific feature of idolatry that is missing from the other textual witnesses of this passage. The following dirge, in verses 19 to 20, and its special interpretation confirm the above findings while enriching the two conflicting portrayals of idolatry. Note that my punctuation slightly differs from the syntax coded by the cantillation tradition of the Hebrew Masoretic text. Hoi omer לעץ הקיצה, אורי לאבן דומם הוא יורה. הנה הוא תפוס זהב וכסף, וכל רוח אין בקרבו. ואדוני בהיכל קודשו, הס מפניו כל הארץ. Alas for he who says to the wood, Wake up! Rouse yourself, he instructs the silent stone. Behold, it is plated with gold and silver, but there is no breath in it at all. Whereas the Lord is in his holy temple. Let the whole earth keep silent before him. The prophetic utterance is designed like a lament, as indicated by the typical opening with the interjection hoi, alas, and focusing its attention on the human agent that speaks to the idol, expecting it to respond. The prophet again stresses the material properties of the idol, which is made of wood and stone and covered with precious metals, while emphasizing that it is lifeless and unresponsive to the human expectation to communicate with an absent deity. Contrary to the idol's Yahweh does reside in his shrine, although it has no iconic representation there. And the silence is not a characteristic of him, but rather of the world that is in awe of his majestic sovereignty. Grammatically, the passage is couched in participial forms and nominal clauses, which are the Hebrew counterpart of agnomic present. As with the admonition, so in the dirge, the perspective is by no means confined to a particular people, but rather extends to the whole world and reflects a universalistic outlook, even though the name deity is otherwise known as the God of Israel. At the same time, the idol's lack of vital signs, as well as human silliness, are both contrasted here with a demonstration of real divine authority, which was not mentioned earlier. Thus, while the admonition's frame of reference seems to be primarily that of practical wisdom, as indicated by both its rhetorical design and conceptual reasoning, the dirge is presented as a theological assertion. The theological perspective of the passage, though, is not anthropocentric, but rather metaphysical. The silence that God's presence instills is in the whole earth, namely the natural world at large, not just the parts inhabited by humans. An entirely different view is presented in the Pesha interpretation of these verses. Pishro al kol hagoyim, asher avdu et האבן ואת העץ, וביום המשפט יכלה אל את כל עובדי העצבים ואת הרשעים מן הארץ. Its interpretation concerns all the nations who worship the stone and the wood, but on the day of judgment, God will destroy all the idol worshippers and all the wicked from the earth. The cult directed toward stone and wood, according to verse 19a, is taken here as typifying not humans in general, but rather the nations, that is, non-Jews, in particular. Again, narrowing the universal perspective into an ethnically oriented viewpoint, one that implicitly prioritizes the ethnic identity of the implied author and readers over that of virtually everyone else. The qualitative reorientation has some quantitative implications as well. In the dirge, about 2/3 of the text is devoted to describing the idols and their worshippers, and only 1/3 depicts God as a king at his palace. In the Pesher interpretation, this ratio is reversed. The description of the idol worshippers is compressed into the first relatively short clause, whereas the picture of God at his shrine is developed into an elaborate apocalyptic scene of future judgment and execution. The awe that all nature experiences in the presence of God is transformed in this scene into a sense of horror by the pending annihilation of most humankind. Intriguingly, this procedure is applied to two groups of people, only one of which, the idol worshippers of the Atzabim, was mentioned beforehand, whereas the second, the wicked, Harishaim, makes a debut appearance in the present context. As most scholars agree, this second group apparently refers to Jews who do not share the sectarian worldview, namely, those that are beyond the social circle and ideological mindset of the sectarian movement. The distinction between two groups destined for destruction, however, may be exegetically anchored in the underlying scriptural text, even though this is not immediately evident. Note that the prophetic passage offers a double characterization of the idols that is not directly rephrased in the Pesher interpretation. The idols are described as being plated with gold and silver, Hinehu tafus zahav v'chesef, and as lacking the spirit of life, v'chol ruach en bekirbo. The Pesherist, however, may have transferred these two descriptions from the idols to the human agents, taking the first to refer to the foreign idol worshippers of the Atzabim, and the second to domestic adversaries, Harishaim. Taken together, the two Pesher units present a view of idolatry whose building blocks are well familiar from biblical literature, and yet their combination seems to reflect a cultural sensitivity that is different from anything one finds in the Hebrew Bible. Thus, the identification of idol worship as a social marker of non-Israelite nations is firmly rooted within biblical literature. The same is true of the eschatological expectation for the future obliteration of both idols and idolaters from the face of the earth, as well as its framing as the result of a legal procedure. But the equation between Gentile idolaters and domestic opposition, so typical of Qumran sectarian literature, is generally alien to biblical literature. The phrase Day of Judgment, Yom HaMishpat, is an innovation of the Second Temple period, encoding an extremist, apocalyptically minded crystallization of the legal framing of the eschaton. By the same token, various biblical texts focus on idolatrous cultic practices, but in Pesher Habakkuk, this particular emphasis takes over all other perspectives. The Pesherist has no interest in the phenomenological distinctions that his scriptural proof text has. The prophetic contemplation about the essence of the idols as inanimate man-made artifacts finds almost no echo in the Pesher interpretation. In its stead, the Pesherist underscores the human response to these items, namely the cultic practices directed towards them. In modern, anachronistic terms, one might say that the Pesherist adheres one-sidedly to a, quote, social scientific, unquote, functionalist theory of idolatry, whereas its prophetic source also entertains a, quote, philosophical, unquote, essentialist theory for defining the same phenomenon. These differences can be described as the result of a multifaceted process of conceptual consolidation, informed by apocalyptic thinking. Of the relatively broad variety of vantage points about idolatry that one finds in the Hebrew Bible, the Pesherist selects only a few that fit his own worldview, which is characterized by a dichotomous perspective of history and society, contrasting between a righteous minority, the Pesherist's own in-group, and a blundering majority, basically including everyone else, and emblematically represented by the idolatrous Gentiles. Moreover, this rigid perception is emotionally charged by an uncompromising expectation for a final resolution of the baffling reality, appropriately depicted by the notion of the Day of Judgment. As the expected sentence must be brutally clear-cut and sweeping to an enormous scope, It can only be divinely sanctioned. These conceptual features translate into the literary structuring of the pair of Pesher units discussed here. While the prophetic admonition and the following dirge differ markedly in their literary form and rhetorical design, the Pesher units that explain them feature an identical and effective bipartite pattern. Each part consists of a single clause, the first dealing with the present and the second predicting the future. The first part is phrased as a comprehensive generalization. Pesher hadavar al kol pisle hagoyim. The interpretation of the matter concerns all the idols of the nations. Pishro al kol hagoyim. Its interpretation concerns all the nations. By the same token, the second part asserts the predictable and unambiguous results of the Day of Judgment. First, vehem lo yatzilum beyom hamishpat. But they, that is the idols, will not save them, the nations, on the day of judgment. And then, וביום המשפט יכלה אל את כל עובדי העצבים ואת הרשעים מן הארץ. But on the day of judgment, God will destroy all the idol worshippers and the wicked from the earth. There is therefore a symmetry between the Pesher units and across their constituent parts, which reflects the Pesherist's profound conviction that idolatry may seem like an undeniable aspect of present reality, in which Judah is populated by pagan communities alongside Jews, but it is actually an expression of human vanity, doomed to be cleared out by the pending ultimate demonstration of true divine power.
Thank you for your attention.
Welcome back to our second session this morning on idolatry and what makes an idol, and what makes a god a god. It is my great pleasure to introduce one of the co-organizers of the conference, Massimo Gargiulo, who is currently the pro-director of the Cardinal Bea Center for Judaic Studies at the Pontifical Gregorian University, where he is also associate professor in the Department of Biblical Theology. He is also a visiting professor at the Patristic Institute Augustinianum. His areas of interest include Hellenistic Judaism, the New Testament in its Jewish context, Jewish-Christian relations in antiquity, and Spinoza's grammatical theory. Among his most recent publications is Il Profumo di Abramo, a book on ancient Jewish and Christian exegesis concerning Abraham, published in the Il Melograno series, which he co-directs with Marco Cassuto Morselli. He will be speaking today about Abraham and the rejection of idolatry in Philo of Alexandria and late Judaism.
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you all. So before starting, just a clarification about the title that is in the program of my paper. When I translated that from Italian, I kept the wording late Judaism in English, which, as is well known, has been the subject of debate. Needless to say, I intended exclusively as a chronological label, referring to works composed between the Hellenistic Roman period and the Rabbinic period. If we will publish the proceedings of this conference, of course, I will in any case revise the English wording. So I am projecting my paper. I hope that it will make easier for you to follow. So in the present text, I intend to offer a general overview of the theme of idolatry in Philo of Alexandria, and then to focus in particular on Abraham. The first theme has, of course, already been examined in scholarly studies. Useful starting point is the analysis by Francesca Calabi. So Philo's approach develops along two directions. First, he discusses idolatry and its evils. He lists its various forms and highlights its dangerousness, for example, the attraction exerted by painting and sculpture, or the fact that, on its basis, constellations or animals are regarded as divinities. The most serious harms of idolatry is that it leads to atheism, since believing in a false concept of God is philosophically equivalent to not believing in God at all. On the other hand, he contrasts idolatry with the true worship of God. He declares that it runs counter to the uniqueness of God, the idea of providence, the greatness of the Mosaic law, and the unknowability and ineffability of God. In Philo's view, idolaters overturn the universe insofar as they confuse and exchange the created with the creator, the corporeal with the uncorporeal, and assign greater value to the artifact than to its maker. If the first commandment establishes the principle of divine monarchy, worshipping created things means attributing honors to rulers of inferior authority rather than to the one true king. God, of course, he is immaterial, invisible, and accessible not through the senses, but through intellect alone. Polytheism, therefore, is not only belief in the existence of multiple deities, but also the divinization of the part instead of the whole, the effect instead of the cause. From this perspective, polytheism coincides with atheism. Idolatry, moreover, can move from the material sphere to the ethical one. The biblical prohibition of images of gold and silver is also interpreted as an exhortation addressed to the greedy, not to divinize wealth. Others, in turn, divinize sensible realities and the passions and subject themselves to them instead of to the intellect, or even go so far as to divinize themselves. Included here is also the critique of the city as the place of perversion that pays honor to what is vain. In this regard, at the beginning of the Decalogue, Philo compares the inhabitants of cities to the children of prostitutes, since like them they honor not their own true father, but all the idols to which they dedicate paintings and so on. Explicit passages against idolatry are found in Philo's commentaries on the second commandment. For example, in the Decalogue, where it is said, with reference to Egypt, that God, in his legislation, forbade the deification of any object, or in the special laws, which also interprets idols symbolically as representing vain things, such as wealth, that humanity worship. Again, in special laws, where it is stated that whoever violates the first and second commandments has death as a just punishment. Specialibus 1 sets out the different types of idolatry. Philo insists on the way in which material idols open the way to false beliefs when people abandon faith in the one true God and instead pursue glory and wealth or mythical tales. Poetry and art cooperate in leading astray those who allow themselves to be ensnared. On the other hand, the folly of human beings, which leads them to divinize heavenly and visible gods, also drives them to assign bodies and forms to other gods, thus expanding impiety. From this indeed derive temples, altar, and rites. It is against this that the divine commandment not to make idols is directed. In Philo's writings, it is possible to identify, alongside the classification of different forms of idolatry, also hierarchical taxonomy of them. This is revealed in a passage of Decalogue where Philo states that those who worship the moon, the sky, the universe, and the parts they contain as if they were gods go astray, since they glorify subjects instead of the sovereign. Nevertheless, they cause less harm than those who, each according to their own whim, fashion wood, stone, silver, and fill the whole earth with images of idols. Here, Philo follows the Exodus in which he recognizes the first two commandments. He distinguishes intellectual error, situated at the level of understanding the nature of the divinity, from the manufacture of painted representations, and he also establishes a hierarchical distinction between them. In the first case, the error consists in confusing the created order with God the Creator. In the second, it is a matter of worshipping the work of human hands. At the lowest level stands the Egyptian, a symbol of those who reduce themselves to worship animals. Philo seems to see idolatry as a human invention that arises at a certain moment in history. He sketches a kind of historical development, though not precisely outlined, by presenting the myths concerning the gods and the cults associated with them as a deliberate attempt to conceal the truth, without explaining what motivated the mythographers, nor how such cults spread. He merely states that the majority of people fell into error at a certain point, whereas The Jewish people corrected the fault of the others. Philo does not invoke any demonic force to explain the wandering of the greater part of humanity. It seems that in his perspective, humanity as a whole is one day called to turn back toward monotheism. In short, one could trace a trajectory whereby a natural monotheistic religiosity at a given moment in history is corrupted by idolaters, awaiting a return to its original dimension. A transitional phase of this history would be the worship of creation in place of the Creator. The Jewish people were protected by the Mosaic law, which, according to Philo, stands in perfect continuity with the law of nature. The law prepared the Jews to the highest philosophy, since it teaches knowledge of the highest and most ancient cause of all, preserving them from the error of believing in generated gods. One of the most frequent polemical targets in Philo's critique of idolatry is the Chaldeans, guilty of having divinized the constellations and the order of the universe. Alongside them stand, as mentioned, the Egyptians, particularly blamed for zoolatry and for the mythical fabrications connected with it. The clearest manifestation of this is Pharaoh, who denies the existence of God. The Egyptians are the exact opposite of the Jews. With their gaze turned toward earthly things rather than heavenly ones, they not only worship animals useful to humanity, such as oxen, but also all animals that are useless or dangerous. In this, Philo aligns with certain Greco-Roman stereotypes about these peoples. Contact with the classical world can also be seen in a particular form of idolatry, self-worship, when a human being believes he can place himself above all other beings and even above nature. As an exemplum of such an attitude, Philo offers the case of the Persian king Xerxes, who, in his campaign against Athens, sought to yoke the sea and alter the configuration of the land. In Philo's critique of idolatry, Abraham holds a special role alongside Moses, the lawgiver who provided his people with tools to resist. Abraham reproaches those who cannot grasp the true cause and instead focus only on the physical forms they see in the universe, mistakenly believing them to be the source of creation. As a result, they create gods, statues, and images of every kind, rewarding painters and sculptors whom the lawgiver had expressly forbidden. In this way, their polytheism becomes a form of atheism, since they ignore the honor that is due to God. Abraham, who sings a song of thanksgiving and victory, criticized such behavior. In the patriarch's life, Philo identifies a model of the abandonment of idolatry, which is due above all to Abraham's contact with the Chaldeans, who constitute typical exemplars of idolatrous practices. They, in investigating the regularity of the universe and the movements of the constellations according to numerical relationships, had arrived, according to Philo, at the conclusion that the world itself was God. Abraham, on the contrary, opening his soul's eye from the deep sleep in which he was while following the Chaldeans, perceived the one who guides the world. Abraham's conversion in this passage is expressed in philosophical terms, an aspect that will be taken up again in Josephus. In the Migrazione, his departure from the Chaldeans represents liberation from vain concern for celestial things. The stage at Haran is the first step toward returning to oneself, which passes through the senses. From there, the man must progress farther within himself toward the intellect. A variation on this theme appears in Gigantibus, where Philo intertwines permanence and departure from the Chaldeans with the change of the patriarch's name. In the first phase, he is a man of heaven, investigating celestial nature and examining events and their causes, when his name means Sublime Father, the name of the human intellect. Then, made better, he becomes a man of God, and his new name, Abraham, that is, chosen father of sound, refers to reasoning of the virtuous man. In De Virtudibus, there is also reference to Abraham's father, and it is said, as elsewhere in Philo's work, the departure from the Chaldeans also represents a break with paternal error. Terach is described as skilled in astronomy and as a mathematician, one of those who consider the stars as gods and venerate the heavens and the world, believing that all good and evil come from them. since they cannot conceive of any cause other than those included among external sensory objects. Abraham, although coming from this environment, was able to reach knowledge of the one uncreated being. For this reason, he left his homeland, his family, and his father's house, aware that if he had remained among them, the deceptive fantasies of polytheistic doctrine would have made his mind incapable of attaining correct knowledge of the true God. Abraham followed the light and succeeded in seeing what he had not seen before. There existed a guide and ruler of the world who cared for the salvation of the whole and its parts. In this way, he abandons astronomy and, going beyond the matter, ultimately attains knowledge of God. The connection between Abraham and the fight against idolatry, and in particular the astrological cult, places Philo within a rather broad group of texts from Second Temple Judaism. For example, the Book of Jubilees. Abram, having departed from Ur and arrived in Haran, is the protagonist of a famous nocturnal scene in which, now 75 years old, he observes the stars to learn about the rains of the coming months. At this point, a voice within his soul makes him understand the futility of that inquiry, for he realizes that everything is in God's hands. He then raises a prayer to God, asking him to protect him from evil spirits and what he should do, that is, whether to return to Ur or remain there. The divine oracle answers these questions, commanding him to go to the promised land. In this narrative, scholars recognize the complex context of the Maccabean period, in which the Restoration struggled to eliminate the influence of pagan cults. If Abraham is the model of the believer, his father represents the gray area of Jews who tolerated or adhered to idolatrous practices out of convenience or assimilation, while his brothers represent Jews who had fully embraced polytheism. Very similar to the Book of Jubilees is the Apocalypse of Abraham. Here too the patriarch strongly criticizes his father and is portrayed as a man in search of a deeper religiosity. Now, texts such as this reconstruct the background of the biblical narrative about Abraham, also providing a motivation for his call. The only reference in the Bible to such events is found in Joshua, where it is said that the fathers of Israel, including Terah, when they lived long ago beyond the river, worshipped other gods. From here, God took Abraham into the land of Canaan. Similar stories about Abraham are found in various works of the same period or later. In accordance with the biblical prohibition of star worship and divination, Abraham's rejection in many of these sources is linked to his transition to monotheism. However, as Reed notes, there exists another group of texts that refer to the relationship between Abraham and astrology, in which this, that is astrology, is viewed from a different perspective, as one of the sciences that form part of humanity's intellectual heritage. For example, in an Orphic hymn of Jewish origin, we read, "And no one has seen the ruler of mortal man, except a certain unique man, an offshoot from far back of the race of the Chaldeans, for he was knowledgeable about the path of the star," a description in which scholars tend to recognize Abraham. There is also testimony deriving from Alexander Polyhistor of a pseudopolemos. So with respect to Abraham, pseudopolemos is motivated by the desire to glorify him, stating, for example, that he descended from the giants. Above all, he affirms that Abraham surpassed all men in nobility and wisdom, and that he discovered astrology and Chaldean science, and that on account of his piety he was well-pleasing to God. Evidently, for this author, the notice in Genesis 15, where God invites the patriarch to observe and count the stars, reveals what his true primary interest was, because it is also said by him that Abraham transmitted that kind of knowledge to Phoenicians and Egyptians. A similar and positive view of astrological knowledge is found also in Artapanus of Alexandria. In summary, we may say that in the traditions examined here, two aspects of Abraham are exalted, whose difference is caused by the different evaluation of astronomical knowledge. On the one hand, it represents idolatry, from which the patriarch distances himself by refusing to obey his father and separating from the Chaldeans. On the other hand, in accordance with the Hellenistic perspective, it is a science of Eastern origin that Abraham helped to disseminate. So, going toward the conclusion, Philo's insistence against idolatry is generally explained as an attempt to build a boundary around the Jews in diasporic context, particularly in Alexandria. Hence, the attacks directed against the Egyptian as one of the supreme expression of idolatry. These are justified not only by the hostility stemming from the events that culminated in the pogrom of 38, but also by the perceived risk of assimilation, which had affected even Philo's own nephew, Tiberius Alexander. What was at stake was not only correct religious behavior, but the preservation of Jewish identity grounded in the customs of the fathers. The identification of the golden calf with the bull, symbol of Egyptian zoolatry, moves precisely in this direction. With regard to the Chaldeans, Philo's emphasis has been interpreted by some scholars as a reference to Greek philosophical school, for example, Stoicism or Aristotelism. Others have seen in it an allusion to cosmic theology. Still others argue that Chaldeans simply designated someone devoted to astrology or serves as a collective name for those who attribute the universe to false causes. Philo's case is not an isolated one. With regard to the Book of Jubilees, we have already seen how the section describing Abraham's rejection, first of the status made by his father and then of astronomy, is connected to the complex situation of the Maccabean period. More generally, it may be said that almost all Greek-speaking Jewish authors address the theme of idolatry, and here too the explanation is usually found in the fact that they were in contact with Greco-Roman culture. One of the aspects of that culture which most obviously and directly clashed with Jewish religiosity was precisely a certain form of worship, representation of the gods in paintings and sculpture, as well as the veneration of the stars and zoolatry. The literary tradition to which we have referred draw a parallel between Abraham's distancing himself from the idolatrous cults of Nimrod or of his father, and astrology as used as a paradigm of pagan religion. Ancient exegetes thus employed it as a symbol of the polytheistic religions with which they had to contend in everyday life. In this respect, Abraham could function as a model for the rejection of such behaviors. The picture, however, is, in my view, less straightforward. If we look at Greek and Roman sources more or less contemporary with Philo, one of the features that very frequently emerges concerning the Jews is precisely their refusal of assimilatory practices, especially idolatrous ones. A well-known passage from the Antiquitates of Varro, preserved by Augustine, praises the ancient Roman religion, recalling the 170 years during which the gods were worshipped without images, a situation which, had it endured into his own day, would have resulted in a purer, castious cult. Without quoting him directly, Augustine informs us that, as proof of a purer religion, precisely because it was aniconic, Varro cited the Jewish people. While it is true that Varro here followed authors such as Theophrastus and Decateo, the Antiquitates most likely date to 5045 BCE, when the Jewish community in Rome was already well established and known. Indeed, Varro mentions them as a contemporary example of a cult uncontaminated by images. Later, Tacitus, in the famous excursus of the 5th book of the Histories, makes similar remarks. The Jews conceive of one God grasped only by the mind, since they consider it impious to represent him in human form. It is noteworthy that he says this while contrasting the Jews with the Egyptian, worshippers of animals and hybrid figures. It is possible that such descriptions offer a somewhat distorted image of the Jews, emphasizing an aspect so far removed from Greco-Roman practices as the rejection of images. A different picture emerges, for example, when one considers painted synagogues, such as Dura Europos, statues found within synagogues, funerary representation, mosaic floors, coins, and seals, all of which seem to point to a more dynamic reality. It is plausible that aniconism was reiterated by authors such as Philo precisely because different tendencies did in fact exist, especially in the periods of the heightened exposure to pagan cults. Nevertheless, testimonies such as those cited above and others that may be added are in perfect agreement on this point, describing it as a contemporary phenomenon pertaining not only to the conquered Jerusalem, but also to Rome and other diasporic communities. Tacitus himself, in the same passage, states, "Therefore they set up no statues in their cities, still less in their temples." Moreover, the assimilatory tendencies that scholarship often proposes as a justification for the anti-idolatrous insistence of authors such as Philo are frequently contradicted. One may think, for example, of the famous satire 14 of Juvenal and the way in which it emphasized the Jews' complete closure toward the outside world, as well as the strangeness of their sacred tradition. Authors of the same period or slightly earlier also suggest an influence in the opposite direction. Seneca, again, as reported by Augustine, claimed that victoribus leges dederunt, and Persius attests to the spread of typically Shabbat practices even among non-Jews. So the sum of these facts must, in my view, at least lead us to raise a question. The classical sources are fairly consistent in mentioning their rejection of any idolatrous tendency, often in contrast with other peoples, such as the Egyptian. They also emphasize their reluctance to become part of the Greco-Roman world, a fact noted in particular by their refusal to venerate the Caesars, because as we know, the only true sovereign worthy of worship for them was the heavenly one. In light of this, my question is it possible to hypothesize that in authors such as Philo, the anti-idolatrous stance was not exclusively attributable to a concrete fear of cultic and religious assimilation? And what can his reading of Abraham tell us in this regard? Now, on the one hand, it is important to recall a constant feature when approaching Philo, namely that his reflection arises from the Bible, which therefore also determines the themes on which he dwells at greater length. Certainly, the struggle against idolatry is a significant biblical theme. On the other hand, however, there is also the intention to construct a gallery of biblical heroes to be set against those of the pagan world. This is an operation similar to the one that, with regard to Josephus, Reed describes in very clear terms. These were attempts analogous to those made, mutatis mutandis, for their own civilization, for example, by Berosso and Manetho. In this way, one could respond to accusations such as those of Appione that the Jews never produced a single remarkable man. In a previously study, I dealt with the possible analogies between the allegorical exegesis of Homeric Odysseus and Philo's Abraham. For our discussion, an interpretation by Eustathius of Thessalonica of Odysseus' stay with Calypso, though dating much later, is very interesting. Eustathius states that Calypso represents astronomy and astrology as the daughter of Atlas, from whom Odysseus departs in order to embrace once more the true philosophy, that is, Penelope. What I mean to say is that Philo's gaze, in addition to being directed toward his co-religionists, could also have been turned toward the Greco-Roman world, and in this context, Abraham became, in a certain sense, the focal point of the discussion. We can understand this well if we consider a passage from one of the most famous satires of Juvenal, the sixth, the one against women. In one section, the credulity of a Roman matron is targeted. It is here, moreover, that mention is made of the Jewish woman who, for a small fee, whispers secret matters into the matron's ear. A few lines later, however, it is said that the greatest trust, that is precisely credulity, was placed in the Chaldeans, a term which, as noted here, had by then lost its ethnic connotation and come to designate astrologers in general. We are only a few decades after Philo, and Juvenal reflects a widespread view. Roman society, even in figures such as Augustus, oscillated between acceptance and rejection of astrology. Manilius, in his poem Astronomica, written between the reigns of Augustus and Tiberius, defended and exalted the dignity of this art, Juvenal, a few decades later, reflects the satirical gaze cast upon the degenerations of these practices. Again, this background, part of the Jewish tradition, as we have seen, exalted Abraham's dissemination of Chaldean knowledge. Philo chose to create distance, interpreting the departure from that land as the soul's journey toward wisdom. As in the case of Josephus, Philo could thus claim the patriarch's rejection of those beliefs which in Rome might be associated with the moral degeneration of society. Another significant element is that Abraham accomplishes all of this as a self-taught figure. At the beginning of the treatise bearing his name, Philo declares that the patriarchs who embodied the law before the Mosaic revelation were disciples of no one and did not learn from teachers, having as their sole guide the law of nature. He states that they were not gnorimoi or phoitetai, terms by which he refers to different categories of schools and students. This meant that Abraham, without even needing the guidance of teachers, had succeeded in understanding the error of the Chaldeans. Philo's interpretation of the relationship between Abraham and the Chaldeans placed him in a complex position regarding the non-Jewish world. Indeed, the Chaldeans were not confined to the Hebrew scriptures. Their influence in the Greco-Roman world was such that their name had come to denote the astrological art, which had both admirers and detractors. The latter were primarily represented by those who, like Juvenal, saw them as charlatans contributing to the corruption of Roman society. When Philo comments on the patriarch's life, he is faced with a complex picture. The biblical narrative said little about the early stage of Abraham's life, but other Jewish traditions expanded at length on his time in Chaldea and his father's role. Two specific orientations have been observed. One that exalts the patriarch's intuition of the divine by connecting it to his rejection of Chaldean idolatry. The other portrays him as a disseminator of Chaldean science. On the other hand, Philo is well aware of what the Chaldeans represent within the Greek and Roman context in which he himself operates, and he must in some way provide an interpretation of the relationship that Abraham had with them. In light of this multifaceted framework, he reinforces the biblical anti-idolatrous polemic, on one hand emphasizing how Abraham is its champion. This provided an ethical and philosophical model for his co-religionists exposed to pagan idolatrous cults. On the other hand, if it is true that many Greek-Roman sources describe the Jews as resistant to these cults, it is probable that Philo also wished to address a non-Jewish audience which was familiar with the Chaldeans. Here, Jewish tradition could boast one of its own heroes who, without even needing a philosophical school, had independently intuited the deceptions hidden behind Chaldean science. To conclude, in one of the most famous poetic passages of antiquity, Horace's Ode of the Carpe Diem, the poet urges the young Leuconoe not to seek to know the day of their death in advance. To know it, Horace says, is nefas, shire nefas. It is not permitted because certain matters belong only to the divinity. He also exhorts her not to consult Babylonian numbers, that is, we might say, not to turn to Chaldean mathematics. Philo, a few decades later, could have responded to this poignant exhortation by saying that the Jews had learned to do so many centuries earlier, as their father Abraham had discovered the true Lord of nature by turning away from fallacious Chaldean calculations.
Thank you. Next speaker is Daniela Shalaba, Associate Professor at the Pontifical Biblical Institute of Rome and member of several scientific international associations of biblical studies, where she has held various positions of responsibility. She is co-editor of the Historical and Theological Lexicon of the Septuagint, Volume 2, and a member of the editorial board of the series Septuagint and Cognate Studies of the Society of Biblical Literature. She collaborates in various international projects on the study of the Septuagint. Her research deals with the Old Testament and the Jewish literature in Greek. Her title for her presentation today is Idols, Private Worship, and Wisdom in Joseph and Asenath.
Thank you very much, Anthony, for this presentation. Thank you to my colleagues for this invitation. The theme of idolatry plays a very important role in the novel Joseph and Asenath. In fact, in the first part of the work, the story of Asenath is narrated. From being a pagan fully devoted to the worship and adoration of the gods, she becomes an emblem of a Jewish metanoia in light of her decisive rejection of all the idols she once venerated day and night. It is through the encounter with Joseph that Asenath becomes aware of the error of her idolatrous conduct. For this, she fervently seeks forgiveness from the God of her future husband through tears, fastings, and acts of penitence. From this perspective, the overcoming of idolatry constitutes the watershed that marks a clear before and after in the story of the novel protagonist. By forcefully rejecting idolatry, which in the text is presented as the highest form of ignorance, she becomes to embrace with equal determination faith in the God of the patriarchs. Asenath lives in a tower set within a large and luxuriant garden in which flourishing trees grow alongside a spring of ever-flowing water that irrigates the entire garden. She resides on the upper floor and the tower together with 7 maidens. The first room is paved with stone of a purple hue. Its walls was covered with multicolored and precious stones, and its ceiling is made of gold. It is within this setting that the idols of whom Asenath venerates, fears, and whom she offers sacrifice each day appear for the first time. They represent the Egyptian gods and are themselves of precious workmanship. They are made of silver and gold, and they are innumerable, and they are hung upon the walls. The setting in which the author depicted the environment in which Asenath lives bears fairy tale and idolized features, whose detailed description find clear parallels in the ancient novels. In this regard, one cannot fail to mention, for example, Metamorphosis by Apuleius, where a particularly luxurious environment surrounding Psyche is described. It is a royal palace set within a grove through which a spring of water flows. Inside the palace, there are silver reliefs depicted with wild beasts and herds of this kind, while the floors are inlaid with precious stones and the walls are constructed in solid masonry of gold. In the novel Joseph and Asenath, the royal splendor and the magnificence of the palace find their counterpart in the garments and ornaments of Asenath, which are likewise marked by remarkable refinement and precious craftsmanship. Asenath's garments are made of purple linen embroidered with gold, and their gild is entirely of gold. She also wears golden sandals and necklaces adorned with stones that hang down on every side. Finally, she wears upon her head a tiara, together with a diadem upon her temples, and a veil covering her head. What is interesting is that in the first part of the novel, prior to her renunciation of idolatry, Asenath is portrayed as a woman whose appearance and behavior reflect models well known to the Alexandria's elite. From this perspective, numerous archaeological and papyrological testimonies from Egypt dating of the Roman period attest to the use of the fines, fabrics, and precious jewelry among wealthy women. In particular, the color purple was introduced into Alexandria milieu through the trade in new substances and plants and through the growing appreciation for chromatic variety. Evidence of this kind of these can be found, for example, in a mummy portrait painted on the cedar wood panel and dated to 1517 CE, which depicts a woman wearing a purple tunic with a black clavus and a mantle, adorned with gold earrings and golden necklace. Similarly, another mummy portrait from Rubaiyat, dated to 116-17 CE, also depicted a female figure wearing a blue vial tunic with a golden clavus and a decorative band beneath the neck, bordered with gold leaves. Over the tunic appears a creamy-colored mantle, and the woman wears earrings and necklace of emerald set in gold. These descriptive elements highlight the sumptuousness of Asenet attire serve. On the one hand, a literary purpose. They are meant to strike the reader, arousing curiosity and capturing attention, while also reflecting a taste that may well have resonated with the contemporary sensibilities. On the other hand, they aim to situate the protagonist with a very precise narrative framework. She is not only a woman of remarkable beauty and wealth, whose appearance reflects the aesthetic preferences of elite fashion of her society. She is also a woman distinguished by an absolute devotion to deities foreigner, to the Jewish world. Indeed, the god of Egyptian appear upon her garments and precious ornaments. Their names were engraved everywhere, on the bracelets and on the stones, and the image of the idols were carved upon them, as you can read in 3:6. This detail, in addition to underscoring Asenet's complete reliance on the protection of the idols she venerates, so much so that she carries with her amulets, which through her ornaments make her appear even more as a devoted worshipper, also reflect in a plausible way Egyptian religious customs and practices. In this regard, many examples from Egyptian context can be cited of pieces of jewelry depicted deities whose function was to protect both the living who wore them and the dead, as attested by finds from tombs. Indeed, such a context have yielded the jewels bearing the effigies of Egyptian divinities, such as these pendants you can see in the slide, in solid gold, which depict Nord Amun, king of gods, Ptah, the creator god of Memphis, Mut, consort of Amun, and so on. Or protective symbols primarily associated with the animal worlds, such as the scarab, the fly, the fish, and the cats, as seen in these amulets, also in the slide, where there are strands featuring flies cast in solid gold, gold bands shaped like dates, and gold lizards, symbols of regeneration. The practice of depicting Egyptian deities in jewelry persisted into the Roman period, during which the cult of Isis became particularly widespread. In this regard, jewelry bearing her likeness is not uncommon. For example, there is a silver bracelet whose medallion featuring a night relief image of Isis, likely originating from Egypt and dating to the 1st-2nd century CE, as well as a gold ring, also probably from Egypt, and dated to the same period on which a small bust of Serapis is affixed. In particular, in Joseph and Asenet, it is specified that Asenet also wears a tiara and a diadem, elements that further attest to the regal status the author intends to convey. This aspect, in particular, positions her as a character who occupies a space between the royal and the divine. This is highlighted not only through the description of the tower's walls, the jewelry, and the amulets worn by Asenet, but also through an expression that has until now received no attention in scholarly research. In Joseph and Asenet 4:2, the narrator notes that her parents, seeing her so adorned, rejoiced greatly because they saw her adorned as a bride of a god, also new verse 2, as you can read in 4:1. This statement, which might at first appear to be merely a poetic similitude, seemingly intended only to highlight Aseneth's solemn beauty in the eye of her father and mother, may in fact allude to a specific image. Indeed, the phrase nymphe theu seems at least ideally to echo a title that existed in Egypt and was conferred upon certain female figures. There were women of royal rank who assumed the title of Hemet Nether, a term composed of 3 hieroglyphic signs and translated into English as God's wife. They were royal princes who did not marry men, but devoted their lives to the god Ammon or at Thebes, for example. Their role was both cultic and institutional. From a strictly religious perspective, in addition to dedicating their lives entirely to the service of God, entertaining him with music and song, they could also officiate for him, offering libations and food as gifts. Certainly, a direct link between Asenath and these figures cannot be demonstrated. Yet, on the other hand, this does not seem to have been the narrator's intention, who employs a Greek construction that points more to a similitude than to an identification per se. The allusion to such figures may suggest Asenath's total dedication to the idols she venerates, nurturing a unique and sacred bond with them. In this sense, Asenath not only worships and fears the Egyptian gods, made of gold and silver and hung upon the walls, but also offered them sacrifice every day. From this passage, the passage 2:3, it becomes evident that Egyptian gods are characterized by a very strong sense of materiality. They are described as hung upon the walls and as being made of gold and silver. This material aspect is repeated several times, not only in this passage, but overall in light of Asenath's later realization that she had been venerating dead and mute idols. In essence, before her transformation, the veneration of Asenath directs towards the gods coincide with the cult she renders to their material forms. From this perspective, Asenath's assiduous and daily worship is motivated by her inner faith, yet it takes the form of a strong liturgical practice, consisting in the offering of sacrifice to the gods. It is interesting to note that in the passage 2:3, the term eidolon does not appear. Nevertheless, this is in fact what the narrator implies. The gods whom Asenath venerates are idols. From this perspective, one witnesses an identification of the god with their material forms, their physical representations. From a narrative standpoint, however, eidolon begins to function as a key term, starting with the encounter between Joseph and Asenath when Joseph refuses to give her the customary kiss of greetings in 8:5. Here, the contrasts become clear between the faith of Joseph, entirely directed towards the living God and resulting in immortality and corruptibility, and the faith of Asenath, who blesses with her mount death and mute idols, eats from their table food of strangulation, drinks from their libation a cup of deceit, and anoints herself with oil of destruction. What at the beginning of the narrative could only be vaguely perceived as an implicit condemnation of idolatry, since it was presented in a positive terms insofar as it was connected with the faith of the maiden, portrayed as a model of perfection, is now clearly made explicit. Idolatry is a deception and ultimately leads to ruin. From the moment of Asenath's encounter with Joseph and the pronouncement of these words, the narrative reveals a decisive turning point. Asenath not only becomes aware of her error, but turns to the God of Joseph, abandoning her faith in the gods and repudiating the idols. Prosoctis and tois idolos sympathis. From this point onwards, In the words of Asenet, the pairing of theoi, referring to the foreign god, and eidola, not only comes to designate the same reality, but also characterizes her discourse in strongly negative terms. In this sense, Asenet transformation involves at the same time a turning away in faith from the god and a repudiation of the idols, together with all the cultic practices directed towards them. Indeed, she will acknowledge her guilt, which consists in having venerated and blessed the idols that she herself now repeatedly recognizes as that nude, nekra kai kofa. At the same time, she despised the private cult she had devoted to them. This aspect, namely the consumption of the offering presented to the gods, is now perceived by Asenet as a genuine sin, and it gives rise to expression of lamentation in which she acknowledges her idolatrous conduct as both erroneous and culpable. The material character of the gods, whom Asenet now explicitly defines as idols, emerge in a particularly striking way when her reputation turns into an actual act of destruction. Asenet breaks all the idols into pieces and throws them out of the window, together with all the libation that had been offered to them. The passages are 10:12, 10, 14. Finally, it is striking to note the reflection attributed to Asenet, which links idolatry to a specific cause. She explains that her worship of idols stemmed from ignorance. The term eidolon occurs nearly 100 times in the Septuagint and translates a wide range of Hebrew words which can be grouped into three main semantic areas. As for figurative representation, eidolon refers to physical objects and includes Asav, Selem, Seraphim, Mipleset, Gelulim. As for designation of deities, eidolon identify foreigner gods while diminishing their ontological status. This includes Elohim, Helil, Habel, Sikus, and Sahir. As for cultic vocabulary, refers to replace or furnishing used in rituals such as Bama or Haman. In the Septuagint, eidolon expresses the fusion between the deity and its image, thus designated both the foreign god and its corresponding cultic representation. For example, in Genesis 31, 19, 32, 34, the term eidolon refers to the household gods of Laban, which Rachel stole and took with her. In these passages, it is noteworthy that Jacob's words, eidola, functions as a synonym for Laban's gods. Similarly, in Numbers 25:2, where the daughters of Moab invite Israel, the Moabite gods are referred to as idols. In this case, the Israelites woman invited the Israelites to sacrifice. The Moabite woman invited the Israelites to sacrifice to their idols, and in contrast, it is stated that Israel bowed down to them. This last passage is particularly interesting because it is one of the cases in which the Septuagint translated the term Elohim as Eidola. This choice is driven by the need to distinguish between legitimate worship and the legitimate illicit one. Since the text clearly refers to the god of Moab, the translator of the Septuagint uses Eidola to differentiate the true god from the foreign deities. Moreover, in the Septuagint, the term eidolon is used to mean the representation of foreign deities, especially in 2 Maccabees 12:14, where the hieromata torn upon Yamneias eidolon are mentioned. Furthermore, in the Septuagint, the term eidolon also serves to denote, describe, and criticize objects made by human hands and are worshipped as gods. From this perspective, a significant text is Isaiah 37:19, where the inconsistency of the idols is clearly highlighted by the fact that they are declared not gods, ugar theoi es an Allah, but rather objects made of wood and stone forged by human hands, erga keiron anthropon. Returning to our text, it is notable that following the trajectory of the Septuagint, the Romans of Joseph and Asenath identify Edola with the Egyptian god. It's clear that the background of the narrative in Joseph and Asenath contains many biblical motifs already highlighted by previous scholarship. However, I would like to focus here on certain Jewish telegumena strictly linked to the theme of idolatry that have not always found a place in the research history of these Romans. First and foremost, it is possible to discern behind the protagonist's abandonment of idols the prohibition imposed by the Decalogue, found in Exodus 20:4-5. Here, as it was known, there is a peremptory command from God not to make idols, nor to prostrate oneself or give call to them. The motivation provided in this text is linked to the jealousy of God, who punishes such a sin to the third and fourth generation of those who hate him. Although the literal fiction of Joseph and Asenath places its protagonists in the time of the patriarchs, and thus before the events of the Exodus, the giving of the law, one cannot fail to observe that this prohibition echoes in Asenath's words. In her soliloquy, she demonstrates a repentance by stating that God of Joseph hates all those who worship idols because he is a jealous and terrible God toward all who worship foreign gods. Joseph and Asenath 11:7. Asenath's new awareness after abandoning idolatry is particularly linked to the conviction of the inconsistency of idols. This motive is especially prominent in sapential writings, which categorically exclude the identification of idols with any divinity by emphasizing their material nature. Thus, for example, in Psalm 113:12, it is stated that the idols of the nation are silver and gold, the work of human hands, and that for this reason they possess no vital function. Similarly, the Book of Wisdom expresses this view, adding that because idols are manufactured by a mortal being, a human person, they are themselves dead things, necron. The same concept is expressed in other words in Wisdom 13:17, 29, where in a polemic against those who pray to trust in idols, they are called apsychos, meaning lifeless object. In Joseph and Asenath, the idea of inanimate idols devoid of any vital function seems to be synthesized in the words first spoken by Joseph regarding Asenath when he meets her for the first time. He refuses to kiss her precisely because she is a foreign maid who worships dead and dumb idols and eats and drinks their libations. The expression idola nekra kai kaufa recurs several times in the words of repentance uttered by Asenath after the adherence of the God of Joseph. This is almost a refrain that motivates the act of smashing the idols and throwing them out of the window. These gestures are fruits of Asenath's new awareness. Idols are nothing but lifeless matter, and worshipping them constitutes not only a grave sin before the God of Joseph, the only living and true God, but also a severe cognitive gap that leads to absurd and senseless actions. The author seems to express this through the protagonist, focusing on the theme of a knowledge of the true God versus the ignorance that characterizes the idolater. The motive of ignorance plays a specific role in the Romans in relation to idolatry. In Asenath's words, agnoia constitutes the cause of her error, which she recognizes as so grave that she feels unworthy to open her mouth before the God of Joseph, whom she discovers to be the one true God. For the mother, agnoia is expressed in Asenath's words as an impudent strength attributed to her status as a virgin. She said, "Io ti emarton soi en agnoia partenos, usakai ades peplanemai." The sin of ignorance finds space in the Septuagint, where in religious context is generally expressed the idea of an intentional or involuntary fault. This occurs, for example, in Leviticus 5:18. I skip a little bit. However, the sin of ignorance in relation to idolatry recurs in Wisdom 13:15, where agnoia serves as the background for the entire anti-idolatrous polemic. Here, agnoia does not designate an accidental sin, but rather the culpable condition in which idolaters live, precisely because they ignore the knowledge of God and persist in that ignorance. Indeed, in Wisdom 14:22, ignorance proper to those who worship idols is designated as the cause of all evils, tatos atakaka, and induce a sort of anesthesia. The individual living in the agnoia of the true God does not perceive the negative upheavals occurring in their life, zontes agnois polemo, but rather finds themselves in a condition of well-being that they even call peace. As can be seen in this verse, 14:22 of Wisdom, agnoia is associated with the verb planao. This is a significant verb in the Book of Wisdom, occurring approximately 8 times, and is reserved specifically for the erring of Gentiles in their search for God. It indicates the wandering away from the path of good, which in biblical and sapiential language is reserved for thoughts and conduct. The verb planao is the same one that appears in Asenath words. In the same vein as the Book of Wisdom, Asenath recognizes her ignorance as a true fault before God, for which she asks forgiveness. Furthermore, her ignorance is described as a state of bewilderment, an unconscious wandering, adaes plananemai. This motive is reiterated in 13:11, where, in light of her repentance, Asenath reclaims the overcoming of this ignorance because now she knows that all the gods she previously worshipped were in reality dead and dumb idols. There is a wordplay, agnusa, non agnon, oti, etc. In other words, the Romans Joseph and Asenath appears to mirror the conception found in the Book of Wisdom, where idolatry, besides being a sin, consists in the ignorance of the true God. Such awareness is nothing but is a deviance from that knowledge, a straying that leads the person to thoughts and conduct far from him. The overcoming of this sin is achieved through the knowledge of the true God and the abandonment of idolatry. Finally, the description on the materiality of the gods or the idols, which as seen occupies a large place in the narrative at the beginning of the Romans, is also one of the cornerstones of anti-idolatrous polemic found in both in Psalm 113:12 and also in chapter 13 and 15 of Wisdom. Here, much emphasis is placed on the material aspect of idols, which constitute the premise for their emptiness and the critique directed at men who came to worship the works of their own hands, rather than the true God, the sole artisan of the force and the beauties of creation. In particular, Wisdom 13:10 speaks of the absurdity of the attitude of idolaters who have placed their hope in idols that are dead things, designating as good that work of human hands, gold and silver fashioned with skill, and representation of animals or useless stones. If one reads the description of the somptuousness and preciousness of idols in Asenath rooms and jewelry against this background, which seemingly aims to attract the reader admiration, it actually constitutes a veiled polemic from the very beginning of the story. It is the barb upon which the author waves the reversal of the narrative. Although idolatry may exert a dazzling fascination, it is nothing more than ignorance that leads away from the knowledge of the true God, the only source of everything and the guarantor of the true life. Thank you very much for your attention.